Good morning, folks. Let's give folks a couple minutes to join. It's 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a presentation on the role of a BA in Agile. My name is Rashmi Liss, and I'm the founder of the BA Knowledge Share. Little bit, just from an introductory perspective, a little bit about my background. I'm the founder of the BA Knowledge Share, as I just mentioned earlier. I've had the opportunity to work with Fortune 100 company for the past 14 years as a business analyst and a little bit of project management work as well. Worked through different domains, so I've quite the gamut of experience in terms of working through even methodologies in terms of Scrum and Waterfall. I do have a certification as a Scrum product owner, and I have a certified master's in business analysis from Boston University, as well as a background in economics. So that being said, with further ado, I am excited to present to you the role of BA in the Agile framework. Before we get started, I thought this would be an interesting kind of a cartoon. As we all know, as business analysts and those that have worked with business analysts, we're so used to being the backbone of a project. So that being said, it's kind of funny in the sense that this cartoon is saying that my brother babysits the kids a lot. He's a business analyst. So it's almost reminding us as BAs that we are the backbone of a project or of projects that are going on. Before we do get started into the meat of the presentation, I would highly recommend, and my preference is that you ask questions as we move along, just so that you get clarity on questions that you may have immediately rather than waiting till the end. So moving on. Today's agenda will be covering the role of a BA in general, the different kinds of software methodologies that are out there. So a lot of us are familiar with Waterfall, with Agile, but really what are the different and what are the differences between these methodologies? I'll be covering that as part of this presentation. Question is around Agile versus traditional framework. What is the difference, right? And then once we get into that flow, we'll kind of get an understanding of the role of a BA specifically in the Agile framework and get into the tasks of an Agile BA. I would also like to walk through a use case as to give you an example of what would a week in a life of, or a day in a life of, or a project effort be for a BA. So we'll walk through a use case. So for those that are familiar with the IIBA, there is a business analysis book of knowledge called the BABOK, and they do recommend in general what the role of a BA should be. The role of a BA is basically to understand, number one, to understand the scope of a project, right? So when you first do get introduced to a project or management gets you to start working on a project, the goal is to kind of work through the scope of the effort. The scope being that of understanding what is the actual work effort involved in terms of the project, right? So the project manager elicits scope of a project, but you as a BA are responsible for eliciting the scope of of the business analysis effort. Before I move forward, I just wanted to pause a little bit. For those that have joined, we got started with the presentation. We haven't gotten that too far, but a couple of housekeeping items for those that just got in. Feel free to ask questions as I move along this presentation. It is an hour-long presentation. As I mentioned earlier, I would rather you get clarification on questions as we move along, rather than we wait till the end. The next piece of the role of a BA is basically to elicit and gather requirements. All right, what does that mean? That means that now you are already in the midst of, or actually would have completed scoping out the business analysis effort. Now you're responsible for going out there and understanding the requirements from your business partners or whoever your customer is, and essentially gathering those requirements. That could be through techniques such as brainstorming, through interviews, things of that sort. You then go out there and you analyze those requirements that you've gathered and make sense of what those requirements are. You organize those requirements as a business analyst. The fourth step is to document requirements. So now that you've analyzed requirements, you start documenting. So mind you, 2, 3, and 4 can happen not one after the other, but they can happen together as you move along. Traceability is critical, right? So it exists in Waterfall, it exists in the Agile framework as well. So it's making sure that you're ticking and tying your requirements right from the user right down to testing to design. So ensuring that there's that traceability that happens, just so that there are no gaps in terms of understanding the requirements. The last two here, number 6 and number 7, goes to the requirements planning and requirements analysis and design. So really, you as a business analyst are responsible for planning out your work effort. It's typically tied to something called as a work breakdown structure. So it's really documenting your line items in terms of, all right, my first step is to meet with the project stakeholders, document the scope, understand the scope. So those are the kinds of items that you would be covering as part of number 6, which is requirements planning. Number 7 is requirements analysis and design. So this is essentially where you as a business analyst, now you as a BA are responsible for the what, right? You're not responsible for the design or the how, but you do get involved in understanding the technology, and the technology is good to understand simply because you know what to go after and what questions to ask for. You're also involved in the design in terms of clarifying or communicating requirements to the tech folks or the developers. So in a nutshell, this is kind of what the BABOK or the IIBA lays out in terms of the tasks or the role of a BA in general. Before I move forward, are there any questions? And feel free to unmute yourselves if you have any questions. Right, moving on. So being in the technology field, working with developers, in my experience, we've worked through different methodologies, such as, I'm sure you've heard of Waterfall, you've heard of Scrum, you've heard of Agile, words like Kanban, and a more recent one was Scrumfall, which was more of a hybrid between Waterfall and Agile. So let me dive a little bit deeper into what each methodology is and kind of differentiate between the major kind of methodologies, if you will, and do a compare with that of Agile. Just to back up a little bit, an assumption for this presentation is that, I'm looking at the role of a BA in terms of Agile, but specifically in terms of Scrum. Let's go to the Waterfall methodology. So Waterfall essentially is a methodology which has been adopted or had been adapted by the software industry and the IT sector for years and decades. what that was, and I'm going to go to the next slide, kind of give you a visual. Slide over. So if you look at the top here, this basically is the waterfall methodology. You really scope your work when you do get a project on a team. After you scope, you design. So the designers kind of get involved in kind of doing initial understanding of the technology or the solution, and architects get involved in that as well. After that's done, then requirements come, and requirements have their own phase, right? So in the waterfall, once you're done with requirements, then you code the requirements, code to the requirements, and then you test to what's coded. Now, what happened was people found that, one, it did not allow for, or it did not accommodate changes to requirements, right? So say, for instance, you get a project or a team gets a project in January of a year, could be this year, and you scope it out from, say, January to, I don't know, February, right? And then you design and analyze from, say, March through April. And then it's only in May that the developers start coding. And then it's only in, say, June or July that things are tested. In that time from January to July, there could be changes that occur from a business perspective, right? So how do we account for these changes? Waterfall was kind of rigid that way. So therefore, Agile was kind of used in order to help and assist in taking into consideration those changes to those requirements and bring in that flexibility. One is that the business loved the fact that they could introduce changes to the effort in between, right, in terms of Agile. And two is that they wouldn't get blamed for introducing changes during the Agile project. So this is more of a win-win, I would say, for both the IT as well as both the business partners or your customers. So that's kind of in a nutshell what Agile Waterfall is as it compares to Agile. So let's go down here in terms of Agile, right? So we spoke briefly about the benefits of Agile. So let's get into the sequencing of Agile. And the reason why I'm getting into the sequencing of Agile is simply because it gives you an understanding about not only the framework, but about the process. And that would help you as a BA understand where you fit in. That being said, let's look at the Agile. Within the Agile framework, as you know, it's iterative, right? So things come one after the other, not right after the requirements are done, but it's more so when requirements are being written or documented or being processed, testers can come in and write their test cases, right? So testers and requirements and the BAs work hand in hand. BAs get the testers up front to kind of work with them through the requirements. And this is actually a good thing because testers have that knowledge to really dice and splice test scenarios, and that helps with requirements as well. In this third row right here, you'll see that you have different sprints. Sprints are basically like chunks of work, if you will, or different iterations for coding to the requirements. As you notice, the developers are not waiting till the end to code, but they are essentially coding while the test cases are being developed, while the requirements are being wrapped up. So they have a good sense, I mean, the devs have a good sense and understanding of what the requirements are. And then you have the testing piece, right? So the testers test what's being developed. What this does allow for is not only it allows for changes, but it also allows for you as a technical team to really showcase your work up front and get that feedback from your customer up front rather than waiting till the end. So that being said, let me pause here and see if you have any questions. So I did want to bring up two things. One is we spoke about Agile versus Waterfall, but I would like to introduce Scrum and Kanban. So Scrum is a framework in Agile. Kanban is as well. Kanban is more of a lean kind of framework, versus Scrum has more of a structured approach. So that being said, let's look at a little bit of a difference between Scrum and Kanban, just so you get a flavor of what those variances are. Within a Scrum, the team roles are different, right? So within a Scrum, you have a Scrum Master, a product owner, and their team members. So a BA's role is not really well defined or set, is not stated explicitly as part of a Scrum team, but BAs, believe it or not, BAs are used quite a bit within the Scrum framework to do the analysis. You have Kanban. There are no set roles as defined. A tester can be a BA, a developer can be a BA, and vice versa. So they tend to kind of overlap those roles. Within a Scrum, the workboards, if you look at, for those who are familiar with tools like Jira or even the CARD framework, columns are labeled to reflect periods in workflow from beginning through the team's definition of done, versus in Kanban, columns are very simple. They show workflow states, but also publish the max number of stories allowed in the column at once. So really, think of it as 3 columns of to be done work, in progress, and done work. So very simple board. Scheduling and cadence. Scrum is a process where you work off of many ceremonies. You could have the sprint planning session. You could have the sprint demo. So there's a lot of more ceremonies involved within the Scrum. Within Kanban, there are no required time boxes or iterations. So it is a lot more simpler. Both have their pros and cons, but I'm not going to get into the scope of the pros and cons of the Scrum and Kanban. I did want to bring in the differences, those, just so you understand what those differences are. Moving on to the Agile philosophy, really quickly, just to touch upon the Agile philosophy. One is the Agile believes in individuals and interactions of the processes and tools. They also believe in working software over comprehensive documentation. Third is customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. Now that's very different than your standard waterfall. However, one caveat is, just wanted to kind of bring out the point that it says customer collaboration over contract negotiation, but I would add a caveat to it unless absolutely needed, right? So contract negotiation, in my mind, is basically requirements, right? So they believe in minimal documentation. However, there may be instances where things need to be documented, just to make sure that there is an agreement between different departments in terms of what the requirements are. Responding to change over following a plan. Once again, you don't have to have a plan, but you need to have a baseline in order to assign stories and things of that sort within Agile. So it's kind of a lean way of doing things. Not that you don't need a plan, not that you don't need documentation, but they do recommend keeping it lean and don't create documentation for the sake of creating documentation. Now we're getting into a little bit of the BA role. So Agile roles and where do you as a BA fit? Number one is within the Agile and specifically the Scrum framework, you have a couple of roles. You have the Scrum Master, who is kind of like the project manager, but they're there to coach and to ensure that the team is making progress. There is a product owner who is responsible for the intake of the work. Now, product owners can be BAs as well, and likewise, BAs can play the role of the product owner, but they potentially could be 2 different roles on a team depending upon the organization itself. Then you have your team members. Your team members could consist of your developers, your QA folks, which are your testers, as well as a BA in addition to product owner if your department or the company separates those 2 or decides to separate those 2 roles. I can tell you one benefit of splitting up the 2 roles is that the product owner is more of a strategic player and facilitates and protects the team. But a BA is someone that can go out there and really dig deep and get the details of those requirements, which is a little different than if a product owner plays a strategic role. So let's get into a little bit on the Agile Scrum framework. Diagram here, there's it kind of neatly explains the flow of the Agile Scrum framework. And it's important to understand the flow because it kind of ties in to the BA role as well. The left to right, if you look at this, product owner gets the intake work from the customer. They do get inputs from executives, team, the team stakeholders, customers. So basically, they get the work that they need to work on. They do have a product backlog that they maintain. So essentially, say for instance, as example, the business partner or customer says, I want a screen, a UI screen, in order to accept payments. So product owner will receive that as an intake. The product owner will put it on the backlog, which is right here, which is essentially a product backlog, which is a list of requirements. They will then go and prioritize those requirements with the team. The team then selects the requirements or the product backlog that they need to work on. And then this basically happens in what they call a ceremony called the sprint planning meeting. The team will also consist of the BA present there, the QA person. So there'll be feedback from the team as a whole. Keep in mind that in Agile framework, the team is the one that drives or organizes the work. So it's not just the PO, it's not just the Scrum Master, it's the team as a whole. You then have the sprint backlog, which is created as an output of the sprint planning meeting. And the sprint itself could run anywhere between 1 to 4 weeks. So I've typically seen an average sprints running from 2 to 3 weeks in general. And within that sprint itself, one is the BA could go out there and do their analysis. The developers could code to a specific requirement. So it's all the work, the grunt work happens within that sprint. There could be multiple sprints. You could plan out your work throughout multiple sprints. So that goes on for a couple of months. Now, within the sprint itself, you could have, and actually you will have daily meetings called a daily Scrum meeting. And in some instances, I've seen it where it's called huddles, right? So where the Scrum Master runs that meeting for 15 minutes, they get their statuses on what work was done. Are there any blockers? At the end of the sprint, there will be a sprint review. And what the sprint review does, it gives an opportunity for the team to showcase their work through a demo. So as an example, the first task that we saw here was a request from the business saying, I want a new payment screen developed within the user interface, meaning in a website. And at the end of this, they could essentially present maybe a demo of the front screen, right? So they could present that to the customer and get feedback sooner rather than later, just so that they can ensure that they accommodate any changes for the following sprint. There's a finished work. Once if things are all well, they get sign off, there's finished work, and the cycle continues. So there's the next sprint that comes up. As part of that one sprint, and each sprint has this, there will be a sprint retrospective. And this is tied to more of the team saying, hey, I could have done this better, or maybe we could have done this better to increase the time frame. So those are your sprint retrospectives, or more like learnings. And this is important because this ties into how well can the team together improve. So let me pause here and see if there are any questions so far. Now, let's get into the next section. Why do we need BAs in Agile? A lot of folks say, well, see that there's some folks in the chat, so okay, thank you. As I said, if there are any questions, feel free to include that in the chat, and I'll get to your questions. Let's go back a little bit. So why do we need BAs in Agile? So many times you may hear stories of, well, we really don't need a BA in Agile, right? But the role of a BA is critical. I think a lot of people, and I've seen delivery leads where they focus a lot on the QA, the tester, the development piece, right? They forget about the BA. Requirements, as that's shown earlier in the cartoon, requirements are the backbone of any project, because if you don't understand requirements, if they're not clear, there's nothing to code to. There's really nothing to test to. So Why do we need BAs in Agile? There's a couple of points here that you can make your case to. One is to elicit complex requirements and analyze the work. Two is requirements are the backbone of any project, as I mentioned earlier. Solution evaluation, so ensure stories meet the definition of done. So many times the teams or the Scrum Master per se kind of coaches the team. There's no one within the team that can say, hey, what is the definition of done for the sprint? What is the definition of done that's acceptable to the customer? So the BA is the only person that can kind of coordinate and communicate the sign-offs and what the definition of done should look like. So the BA's role becomes critical here. You're the conduit between the business, dev, and testers. You're more of a translator, right? So you are the person that can communicate the needs, the changes to the devs and testers. Yes, the Scrum Master exists. Yes, the product owner exists. But the product owner's role, depending upon the industry you're in, depending upon the place where you're in, whether you're in a tech shop or a business shop, a PO is more so strategic, and they facilitate and they protect the team and they protect the backlog. But the BA is more so in the weeds and understands the changes and what needs to be done. It's important the BA is there also to partner with the product owner. So if there is a team and there's multiple sub teams under the team in an agile environment, believe it or not, the product owner is going to be overwhelmed with not just intake, but with also working with on strategic level requirements and working with your stakeholders. So this is a good time for the BAs to partner with the product owner to kind of fill in the gap in terms of providing them with the micro details so that they, as a product owner, can kind of make decisions that are relevant and timely. They work through refinement of the requirements through sprints. Yes, so I can touch base upon that in a little bit, but really your requirements not just end once you're done with your requirements. Remember, there was this whole feedback loop, the demo. So if there are changes in those demos, then the analyst kind of works through more of a just-in-time requirement changes. You're there to negotiate the scope, right? So if you are senior level, you kind of ensure that the scope is negotiated with your stakeholders or with your customers. There's other standard requirements. So basically, you would assist in clarifications, gather, analyze requirements. In some instances, you would test and validate, and some instances, you would prioritize your requirements as well. All right, so finally, as final part of this presentation, one is let's kind of understand the role of a BA3 use case, because many times when we see some presentations out in the market, you get a sense of, all right, this is a presentation, but really what does it and how does it look like in real life? So as an example, I did create more of a hypothetical example or use case, but the marketing department has basically asked for a leads report to be generated that will provide an understanding of the percentage of lead conversions. They send a request to the delivery team, of which you are the business analyst. In this case, if you remember the deck earlier on, let me go there quickly. You have the product owner that would take in the work, basically from the marketing department, and you as a BA, or sometimes product owners do this as well, you kind of would go in and understand, well, what is the business value? And I've seen instances where people have used the business value model canvas, and I can kind of give a presentation about that in a few weeks or a few months, but you understand the business value, who the stakeholders are, and establish a high level scope. So you would kind of take that first stab at working with a PO and saying, hey, let's talk through the business value. So you kind of facilitate that conversation. You also kind of understand, well, who are my stakeholders? Who are the stakeholders that our team needs to work with? And you establish a high level scope. So what is the initial scope? What needs to be out of scope? What are the objectives? So that's your initial, I would say, your initial stab at really kind of defining the project work. The second effort, I would say, is you contact and communicate with stakeholders to talk through the request and determine the high level scope, which is once again ties back to number one. Once you've established the scope, now you get into working through sometimes context diagrams. So these are once again tools that a BA should have in their toolkit. So context diagram would give you a high level understanding of the inputs, outputs in terms of systems. It will also give you an understanding about your business, right? So which business areas are involved, just so you don't lose sight of any missing pieces to the project. You create a user story map and establish the process. So user story map is used widely in Agile. And by the way, I have a presentation on demystifying user story maps coming up in October. So if you have folks that can join the presentation, I would highly recommend you join that, because it is a critical tool within the Agile process. Um, Fifth is you assist the Scrum Master and chunk the work out. So one of the outputs of a user story map is to really break down the work, right? So we keep saying work breakdown structure. It applies to BAs as well. You will assign this, you will work with the Scrum Master and basically say, all right, this is how I as a BA see the chunking of the work. So this is, I don't know, as an example, for the leads report marketing, you could say, generate the leads report. And then email the leads report. So maybe those are your two chunks of work. And then within that, you would break down that work even further. Number 6, you establish the user stories for the backlog with the help of the team. So your goal would be, as a sub output of the user story map, would be to create user stories. Some people use Rally, some people use Jira to create user stories. I've seen folks where they've simply used the card, just put things on a Visio or a Word document and just really break down the user stories that way. However tool you use or whatever tool you use, that's fine. You just need to document the user stories. And then the last is you refine the requirements. And when I say just in time, it's when things, remember, Agile is all about change. So when the output is presented to your customer, you basically expect to see changes, right? So that's where you come in as a BA and you would kind of document those changes just in time. What becomes critical in here is that you document those changes from the original baseline, just so folks know where things are. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions, and it looks like none. So we spoke about user or job stories. So I'm not going to get too much into details here between what the differences are. I'd be more than happy to do a presentation or have a conversation offline about what they are and what the differences are. But typically, think of a restaurant, right? So you go to a restaurant and you as a customer place an order for a burger. Now, the person behind the counter or the waitress will take that order for you. And that waitress will open up a ticket or will write something on her sheet of paper and will hand that over to the cook, right? So think about that sequence of interactions, right? So your customer is basically your marketing department, right? They're submitting a request to the waitress or the waiter, and that waitress or waiter is kind of like the product owner, and then or slash BA, right? And then the ticket or the handwritten note of what the order is that goes to the cook, or could be a developer, is basically that receipt, or that ticket is basically your user or job story. And I've seen arguments where people say it has to be written in a certain format, where as a user, I want the ability to see a report so that I can increase my lead generation. So it could be written in that format, but we can certainly have a presentation, get into details about those, in another kind of a demo. Then, as part of a user story, as a job story, you define an acceptance criteria. So you really define your acceptance criteria, meaning your scenarios, if you will, in a certain format, given what thens. So this kind of drives you towards your definition of done within Agile, and this kind of becomes an important piece of the for testers and for developers to understand the scenarios. I've typically seen either the BAs write these, or even the developers in certain technical stories write these, or sometimes even the testers kind of define these as well, or they work together to define these. So that's your acceptance criteria. So that's kind of this is kind of the end of towards the end of the presentation. I just wanted to kind of talk through a couple of things before we did end the presentation. This is kind of a funny cartoon. It says, I have a feeling Larry did not understand what I meant when I said our team could use an Agile class, right? So people misunderstand what Agile is, or what the need for an Agile training is, right? It's all about, it's not about being Agile physically or Agile, mentally. It's about a mindset. It's about doing or delivering a specific product in a certain way. So that's kind of what it is. And lastly, please do consider joining the BA Knowledge Share Facebook group. I am the founder of the Facebook group. I do have a blog called baknowledgeshare.wordpress.com. And in general, if you do have questions, please do reach out to me at baknowledgeshare@gmail.com. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. And if you do have any feedback or would like me to kind of help you or build another presentation, more than happy to do that. So let me pause here and see if you guys have any questions. Also, if you have questions outside of this presentation, as I said, um, please feel free to reach out to me separately, and more than happy to talk to you through it. But thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you guys next month, where I do a presentation on the user story mapping. Thank you, and have a great weekend. Bye.